Look at the size of that effect. This was the Labour model, of course. Labour leadership evaluations. Absolutely huge.
Does it have a variation between Blair and Brown?
Yes, it does. Actually, going back, I didn't mention the aggregate level effects. Tony Blair's premiership, you see that? Minus. Blair was regarded as more dishonest than Brown, even though Brown had his problems, controlling for everything else. The MP's expenses scandal had a significant effect, and that's no surprise, but it held up after controlling for all of these different things. The government took a hit on that, which means if it happens again, whoever's in power will take a hit, which is probably a good reason why they should avoid that at all costs. Finally, the coalition government model, rather similar, same kinds of things, behaving in the same way. If the coalition thinks, if people think the health service policies are good, trust the government. If they don't, they won't. Perception of education doesn't play. So Michael Gove gets off free with this, at least according to this data. But perception of fairness are just as important as they are in the Labour case. The cynicism about nobody can do it, well, that plays too, in the same way that you'd expect. Democratic satisfaction important, and so on. At the aggregate level, the omni-shambles budget made the government distrusted, and it had an effect, despite all these other things in the model. There was an election dummy variable honeymoon, but it lasted for about 5 or 6 months before disappearing, more or less.
Paul, how do you account for the very sharp difference in the variance explained between the two models?
That's a complicated thing to do with working out R-squares in multi-level models. It's not obvious at all, but if anybody wants technical stuff, we'll talk about that. There's the coalition model, the simulation, to show what the effects are, and you get a similar picture. Leadership evaluations. If you like Conservative, if you like David Cameron, then you're going to trust the government. If you like Ed Miliband, you're not. And there is a bit of a leadership evaluation for the Lib Dems too. If you like Nick Clegg, you're going to trust the government more. So these leadership things really play both in the Labour period and in the later coalition government period. Okay, wrapping up pretty quickly, these are the conclusions. The policy-related variables play, process really matters. On average, Blair's government was trusted less than Brown's. The change to government in 2010 gave a real boost to perceptions of Labour honesty, but the effect dissipated. Political leadership really matters. And here's something which I think contradicts pretty much, well, at least the tackle in the Westminster Village up to the party conference, which is, Miliband's hopeless, he's way behind everybody and he's all that. Well, we use these thermometers, we call them. Do you like or dislike a leader? And it turns out that in the modelling, they're pretty good predictors of voting and all kinds of things. They're a good way of measuring it. There's different ways of measuring these things, but they behave very well. And this is the distribution of liking and disliking Cameron and Miliband in the July data. So it's a couple of months old, but only just. And you see what you might expect is that there's a bunch of people who dislike Miliband so much they give him 0, but that's true of Cameron too. There's a bunch in the middle here. There's slightly more people who really like Cameron than like Miliband, but there's not much in it, and their average scores are the same. So all this stuff about, Cameron is way ahead of Miliband. This wasn't true in July. I mean, I don't know what the latest poll, Peter will no doubt tell us later, since the conference. But the leadership effect isn't harming Labour in the way that a lot of people are arguing. That's what we think anyway. Finally, implications. Further analysis, not shown here, which turns it around and says, does perceptions of government honesty, dishonesty change votes when you're taking into account all the other things that matter when you try to understand voting? The answer is yes. It's quite important. But here's a puzzle, and I haven't figured it out yet, but I appreciate your thoughts. If government dishonesty goes up, then the Conservatives lose, Labour gains. It doesn't affect the Lib Dems, even though they're in coalition. So there's something about holding people responsible, attributions of responsibility, in a coalition situation which the public haven't quite got used to yet. And it looks as though the Lib Dems are a bit immune from that. They're also a bit immune from bad economic news too. It looks as though they're sort of kind of insulated a little bit from that. So that's kind of interesting topic. If trust in government is low, next time in the next election, Conservatives lose votes. Labour will gain them. At the moment, the trust variable is behaving, it's lower than average. Remember, the average was a third. It's lower, not much lower, but it's lower than average. So we shall see how that evolves through to 2015. Yes, there's the point about the Lib Dems. And if David Cameron is more popular at the time of the election than Ed Miliband, this will offset the lack of trust in government. So the two can work against each other. But at the moment, the two leaders are pretty much equal in popularity as far as our key measure is concerned. And we'll see, of course, if that changes in the run-up to the election. Okay.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Lots of questions were asked along the way. Are there any quick factual questions for Paul?